It's strange how things go in cycles, even with video requests. For whatever reason, every fall, just as surely as the leaves turn brown, just as surely as the Golden State catches fire, I start getting video requests for one particular topic. That topic being atheism, and in particular the political phenomenon of new atheism. To be sure, I have made videos addressing atheism and the prominent new atheist movement in the past. Still, for whatever reason, people keep asking me for more. I suppose the request is not surprising. Despite its recent declines, the atheist community is still, by the numbers, one of the largest communities on YouTube. Being a somewhat prominent religious vlogger, it makes sense that people would want to hear me respond to this community's challenges. Why are you not an atheist? Why are you a Christian? What was your journey to being religious? And why do you, and really everyone on the right wing, whether they believe in God or not, complain about the new atheist movement and new atheists generally? In fact, if religion is so important to you, why don't you spend more time talking about it? These are all good questions. Some have short answers, others don't. To start in no particular order, as someone who was once very involved in the Christian versus atheist debates of 2007 to 2012, I feel particularly aware of the limitations of theological discussions. Arguments over the existence of God, while important, remain in any serious capacity abstract and esoteric. The proofs and counterexamples are old, in most cases they're literally ancient, and genuinely new propositions are rare, and when they come up, quite involved. Most common disagreements over the formal existence of God proofs come down to accepting or rejecting basic premises and rarely revolve around syllogistic errors or errors in fact. And, as anyone with even a passing experience in these academic conversations understands, the arguments for the existence of God are not the reason why people are religious, and they certainly are not the reason why atheists reject a religious tradition. In short, apologetics or counter-apologetics are not the battle that atheists are fighting in their minds, despite how much they might enjoy arguing it on the debate stage or the internet. Most atheists are not atheists because they believe in some abstract metaphysical proposition, and most would not have the patience or inclination to wade through a tome written by Alvin Plantinga or some other contemporary. Therefore, weighing in on the question of arguments for or against the existence of God always seems very misguided to me. Instead, for this video on internet atheism, I want to address atheists as they actually exist. When I watch these channels online, when I see what they talk about, when I hear the subjects that they're interested in, I feel distinctly that I need to deliver a much more fundamental message before any more abstract conversation about spirituality or philosophy or even politics can occur. And this message begins with one critical observation. Atheism is boring. Atheism is boring? Perhaps this is a tough sell coming from somebody who thinks God belief holds in balance the ultimate and eternal fate of humankind. But what about for a non-believer? For someone who regards God as a delusion, or the equivalent of a belief in a flying spaghetti monster, or a teacup orbiting Mars? For me, it's hard to see how a denial of any delusion could hold the interest of anyone for long. For instance, I certainly don't believe in either the orbiting teacup or the pasta monster, but alternatively, I can attest certainly that neither of these non-beliefs has gripped my soul or my mind with its relevance. Yet for some reason, when it comes to the 21st century new atheist movements, what should be a fundamentally banal subject has inspired, of all things, a very prominent passion in people. And this, I think, is unique. Of all the completely unoriginal elements in new atheism lifted from previous secular movements, there is one thing that the post-2005 skeptical movement had that was all their own, and this was a sense of excitement. The non-believers of the 19th century and the 18th century typically professed an atheism eclipsed by some larger ideological project. For Hume and Marx, removal of belief in God was a portal towards new and better ideals. For the new atheists of the 21st century, however, non-belief itself is the product. That's what they came to defend, to promote, to celebrate. So sign up, join the mailing lists, buy our books, and come to the conventions dedicated to atheism so we can talk about things we don't believe in again and again and again. The only thing that's surprising is that people followed them. By the millions they came and signed up to the ideology that, by its definition, contained no actual content or real reason for being there to begin with. I mean, at an emotional level, I get it. Everyone's a teenager at some point in their lives. Everyone knows the anger when you discover an old and cherished belief to be false. Everyone wants to push back and get rid of falsehood for its role in impeding the truth. Moreover, when wrong beliefs are in power, they constrain people's actual lives. For this reason, beliefs of the rulers are always interesting, even if all you do is oppose them. No one faults a silenced artist for hating his censor, or the political prisoner for hating his captor. There is a time and place where caring deeply about the wrongness of certain ideas is essential, and essentially human. Yet in the world of atheism, for whatever reason, the dynamic seems strangely inverted. The importance of non-belief only ever seems to become more prominent and louder as the political power of the religious ideas it opposes wanes. For early non-believers, living in the age of throne and altar, atheism was a subdued, often tragic and intellectual affair. In our own modern secular age, with religion constantly receding, atheism is a raucous, loud political movement and a closely held personal identity. The need for atheism in practical politics is less clear than ever, even as its voice in the public square grows ever louder. Certainly this appears to me to be a mystery. Years ago, attending Christian versus atheist debates, I remember observing this mystery firsthand. One could easily notice a distinct contrast in enthusiasm between the two sides of any debate. For the most part, the Christians arrived at these debates with a tentative demeanor, like a person entering a job interview. Some were confident, some were apprehensive, but none seemed to be particularly excited. Not so with the atheists. Talking to them almost a decade ago, I could feel a strange energy in their voices. It wasn't jovial like people attending a party, although many oftentimes affected this manner to seem more approachable. Rather, it was ecstatic, as if they were waiting for something liberating or transcendent to occur within the words of this very dry and formalized debate on metaphysics. The atheists present seemed as if they were in the process of being delivered from some great evil, as if they were waiting for some profound new idea that could possibly remake the world. But what were they actually waiting for? The non-believers present only ever seemed to talk about what they didn't believe in. A common answer, certainly the answer preferred by atheist luminaries, was that the energetic feeling of liberation was the natural consequence of downtrodden victims of religious abuse finally encountering free thought for the first time. But was this generally the case? Certainly not in my experience. Although I did, on rare occasions, encounter genuine and heartbreaking testaments of religious abuse, for the most part, the non-believers in attendance demonstrated very little knowledge of religion, let alone some first-hand bad experience that would lead them to be traumatized. To be sure, the atheists had grievances against religion, but their grievances seemed bizarrely second-hand and uninformed. People would arrive at these events proclaiming, "Get your rosaries off my ovaries," who didn't even know what a rosary was. 20-year-olds would breathlessly relate pre-Vatican II stories of nuns smacking hands with rulers, stories which they most certainly were too young to have ever experienced. And of course, almost all atheists would talk about the ever-present boogeyman of fundamentalist, evangelical Christianity, even though most people, when pressed, had a difficult time defining exactly what evangelical was. To me, it seemed like there was something else going on. For years, I would listen to atheists in person talk to me about their lack of belief, and all I wanted to ask then, all I still want to ask now to the atheists online is, why are you interested in this activist movement? Why are you interested in new atheism? Why does it consume your time and attention? What's in it for you? After all, you keep on assuring me that atheism is just a lack of belief, so it's apparent that no one's getting any positive information about the state of the universe. Why make this your identity? Why make non-belief your central truth? Why meet on this topic month after month and year after year? Can't you see that atheism is boring? Here, before I go further, I want to offer a disclaimer. What I say in this video is not a reason for God belief, or an argument against disbelief in any given deity. If you want theology, or if you want apologetics, please look elsewhere. What I intend to explore here is a sociological anomaly within the phenomenon of New Atheism, as it appeared in the early 21st century, and this mystery begins with atheism being boring. Now, being boring is not a reason to reject a belief. I myself have many boring beliefs, and I'm quite comfortable with most of them. However, when it comes to concepts used to organize groups, used to organize one's life, being boring is a good reason to question why a certain idea holds claim to your time and devotion, especially if you might expect that its boring exterior is covering up something more nefarious going on behind the scenes. Organizing a community around something pointless and boring is bad enough, but being surrounded by people convinced a transparently hollow notion is profound, that quickly moves from being boring to being weird, and then from being weird to being creepy. The thing about popular things that don't seem to have a point is that oftentimes they do have a point, just not one that people are ready to admit in public. Like that high school party where everyone hangs around the dim-witted, socially awkward nerd. It's a mystery why he's so popular until you realize that that same nerd has personal access to a cabin in a houseboat on Lake Tahoe for spring break. These amenities he has access to don't make him any more interesting, but it does remove the mystery of his sudden popularity. To vary my metaphor in a more literary direction, I'll return to my favorite Sherlock Holmes mystery, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's famous story, The Red-Headed League. I always liked this story because of its inversion of the standard mystery tropes. Typically, a mystery begins with a crime, an extraordinary act of iniquity that it's impossible to ignore. Classically, this is a dead body. Instead, the short story, The Red-Headed League, begins with an unusually boring event. A bumbling shopkeeper named Wilson is called out of his shop every day by a strange red-headed league, just to be well paid to do pointless work because of the color of his hair. Of course, under the brilliant deductive mind of Sherlock Holmes, the mystery is soon exposed. Wilson's shop is secretly being used as the staging area for a bank robbery, and the Red-Headed League itself is simply a fictional alibi for the sole purpose of luring the shopkeeper Wilson away from the scene of the crime. Interestingly enough, however, what ultimately prompts Holmes' discovery is not some circumstantial evidence of malfeasance, but simply the pointlessness of the Red-Headed League itself. In short, the League has no purpose. It has no reason to exist other than to be pointless. It is an alibi in search of a crime. Without a bank robbery, none of what the Red-Headed League does makes any sense. In convoluted lawyer speak, we might say that the crime is the League's sine qua non, the element without which its existence ceases to be rational. Now, perhaps it's just my paranoia speaking, but it's hard not to see the New Atheism of the 21st century as something very much like the Red-Headed League, independent of some larger real thing that justifies its existence. Does any of it make sense? Certainly, explanations need not be complex. In fact, for most common critics of the New Atheist movement, its existence can be reduced to a mere psychological phenomenon: intellectual masturbation. People like to feel smart without working, and New Atheism is simply a flattering and low-effort view of the world. Certainly I can attest, in their worst moments, many atheists certainly resemble this image. It would seem for many online non-believer, atheism itself is less about truth than about complimenting their own intellect and feeling smarter than their parents. However, to be fair, the New Atheism that I remember being part of in 2006 was certainly something much more than just vanity. There was there a genuine hope and optimism about what lay in store for the world, a feeling of possibility and ambition, all of which are not emotions that I commonly consider a prelude to masturbation of the physical or intellectual variety. For this reason, I place more weight on the explanations New Atheists have for themselves. Believe it or not, when I counted myself as an atheist, I did not actually consider the project to be a purely negative affair. Perhaps negativity was the cover page of atheism, a necessary reaction to the excesses of the second Bush administration. But what lay behind it, its true motivations, was a positive idea of skepticism. Skepticism was something powerful, It was the pure application of the scientific method to philosophical and political ideas. For the time being, what was needed was a debunking of Christianity, especially in its dangerous evangelical form. But what would certainly follow soon after this debunking would be an expansion of the possibility which post-religious humanity held within its grasp. Once clear of superstition, secular luminaries would seed the ground where they once reaped, and would bring forward a new stronger basis for the morality and ambitions of Western civilization, and with it all sorts of new ideas and actions, free from mendacity of all kinds. This was a beautiful vision, everywhere implicitly promised in the writings of the four horsemen of atheism, Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens. And even now when I speak to atheists in 2020, especially to the atheists not fully on board with radical progressivism, I hear something akin to this hope repeated again. The troubles of modernity are real, and atheism does not directly address them. But soon, once we have debunked this latest round of bullshitters, once we have debunked this latest round of anti-scientific superstition, skeptical thinkers will be able to begin the project of human renewal and the Enlightenment in earnest. Now, far from me to rain on anyone's hope, but when this explanation, or any other such like it, makes an appearance in this year of our Lord 2020, I find myself at a complete loss. Have we truly taken stock of the state of civilization in present day, the state of the world? Where, may I ask, are our secular atheist luminaries? How do the ever-vigilant guardians of truth and reason fare in this chaotic age which seems by the day ever more consumed by insanity and irrationality? By any reasonable assessment, the promise has failed us. Of the original horsemen, only one, Sam Harris, even seems vaguely aware of the current state of the post-2012 world. Currently, Sam Harris is fast trying to patch his supremely dated liberal takes to address relevant cultural problems. Predictably, Sam talks endlessly, yet never seems to move the conversation forward in any meaningful way, and also never seems to understand why his old 2006-era tricks aren't working this time around. Of the rest of the new atheists, it seems that most other luminaries, from Daniel Dennett to A.C. Grayling, have fallen deep into the cult of liberal progressivism, adopting a straight cosmopolitan globalist party line when they aren't cutting it with radical takes from intersectionality and straight-up Marxism. I personally wonder why people like P.Z. Myers think I should be quaking in my boots over evangelical Christians not liking stem cell research in 2005, while his colleagues are presently fast at work abolishing the concept of biological sex from public discourse, canceling scientists for heterodox views, and resurrecting the bloodiest ideology in human history to walk the earth once more. But I guess I must not understand because I'm just not sciencey enough. The great exception to the conquest of political correctness, Richard Dawkins, is currently, in between progressive campaigns to cancel him, preparing to release an incredibly relevant book about outgrowing your religion. In the year of a rampant and entirely secular chaos which threatens to bring the West to the brink of collapse, perhaps he's not the hero we needed, but the hero we deserved? It seems, though, like we didn't deserve much. But perhaps I'm being harsh. Dawkins is, after all, old, and as ever, the rule about dogs and tricks holds. But Dawkins, being the most prominent of the new atheists, did have a legacy. Perhaps he brought forward a new generation of atheists who are carrying forward his own craft of cutting through the irrational bunk that impedes human progress. If so, how does this new generation of atheists fare in the year 2020? Now, perhaps my mind is biased by YouTube, but the successors of Dawkins in present year are not a pretty bunch. For those not immediately sucked into the far-left rabbit hole of 2013, the remaining anti-SJW atheists have now either found a home on the right, or have inadvertently been sunk into the morass of smug left liberalism, spiked with just enough democratic socialism to seem topical and relevant. Here, I cast my gaze on channels like The Amazing Atheist, Armored Skeptic, Hannah and Jake, Quentin Reviews, and Shoe on Head. As always with this group, positive conviction is rare and governed by fashion. Ideas are picked up and discarded quickly as they appear relevant or common sense. Each is rarely examined deeply. However, ever present in the skeptic's mercurial and contradictory ideology is the unmistakable notion that their beliefs, somehow, set them aside as particularly rational and particularly good people. Even their new current fascination, democratic socialism, is notable for how few of its skeptical defenders seem genuinely interested in its content, even as they sing its praises. Of course, democratic socialism fits the desires of the skeptical community like a glove. Adopted between 2017 and 2020, when the atheist vlogosphere was under fire for their vacuous moderate political stances, democratic socialism provided the perfect response for those looking for easy and positive solutions. In fact, socialism had a ready-made answer for almost every thorny and complicated political problem. Capitalism did it. To boot, being a democratic socialist meant that its atheist adherents could resurrect all of the comfortable boogeymen from the Bush administration: the heartless right-wing exploiter, the intolerant social conservative, and the abstract resistance of Americans to rational progress so obvious to all of the smart people. And, best of all, unlike a real religion like Christianity or Islam, socialism posed absolutely no restriction to an adherent's consumerist lifestyle whatsoever. And I know the refrain: there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. But when did this statement go from being a tactical statement about labor and commodity production to a secular write-off for all consumption, no matter how base or indulgent? Who knew you could staple a picture of Karl Marx to your life dedicated to plastic crap and video games and instantly transform from being a consumer whore to a socialist hero? As leftists, they like talking about privilege, but privilege is only personally applicable to people on the right wing. Otherwise, all talk of privilege is safely systematized, and anyone can be confident that their revolutionary ambitions will never cut into their entertainment budgets. And all the while, the real cutting questions, the real cutting criticism about global corporatism, or socialism, or resource management go unasked and unanswered. But hey, at least you can still make fun of red state evangelical Christians like Jack Chick. But I think we should return to the original question that motivated this examination: whether the New Atheist movement can be explained as the first step to a general methodological application of scientific rigor to the field of culture and politics. Are the modern New Atheist content creators the simple extension of this project? Is their approach to politics the natural path made necessary by the latest science and the most honest application and observations of our universe? I suppose ultimately this comes down to opinion. Perhaps we are in an age where a generation of keyboard revolutionaries gorging themselves on consumer products and self-righteous, poorly examined political platitudes is the teleological endpoint of science and logic. Maybe, dear listener, this is what you had in mind first listening to Richard Dawkins in 2007. It certainly wasn't what I had in mind. And certainly, before I close this analysis, I must address the last elephant in the room: the missing member of the Four Horsemen and my personal favorite skeptical voice during my own skeptic period. That is Christopher Hitchens. Among the horsemen, Christopher Hitchens was the most stylish, the most sophisticated, the most personable. Perhaps most importantly, in hindsight, like Kurt Cobain before him, Christopher Hitchens held the distinction of passing away while his artistic and political movement peaked. As such, when we remember Christopher Hitchens, we remember him at his prime. His work seems static, and for whatever reason, his career, his writings, and strangely enough his followers, act like a bizarre evolutionary holdover and come to us in present day with the absolute least amount of mutation. For myself still, reading or listening to the work of Christopher Hitchens is like a window into what New Atheism was in its glory days. The first thing you notice reading Hitchens is that he's still fun. Hitchens as a prose stylist still holds up. His ardor is exhilarating, even on a rereading. Even now that I know better, it still seems like he's getting at something profound. And you can see this wit on display in his live performances or his recorded debates. The man was a master of the clever insult. His debate frame game was second to none, not to mention his flawless elocution that often left the staggering drawls of his Christian adversaries in the dust. But beyond his posture, likable or not, the question of Hitchens' real ideas is thornier. What happens if one looks beyond Hitchens' style to the legacy of his worldview? How do the intellectual contributions of the man hold up in the cold light of 2020? To be honest, not very well. Hitchens did have his moments of brilliance, but in hindsight, there seems to be very little of principle that can be traced across his career. Hitchens formed his early ideas around the writings of Leon Trotsky, which, under any honest appraisal of history, should be remembered as the most brutal and perfidious member of the most brutal and perfidious organization ever to exist. After moving towards a softer, leftist humanitarianism, and serving briefly as a down-market, Noam Chomsky-like anti-interventionist, Hitchens completely transformed himself post-2001 into an all-out advocate for the neoconservative crusade to conquer the world in the name of democracy. Finally, after even this last ship began to take on water, Hitchens once more reinvented himself as the gloriously godless iconoclast that we all know and love today. Ideologically speaking, Christopher Hitchens was a strange contradiction. He talked about an immoral and uncaring universe, all the while drumming up his audience to heights of moralistic umbrage. He spent the first half of his last decade advocating for the worst policy idea of an evangelical president, only to spend the second half of that decade preaching of the dangers of evangelicals wielding political power. And ultimately, when we stand back from his career, it's impossible to escape noticing that Christopher Hitchens spent most of his life buttressing the very establishment institutions that were fast at work training a generation of activists to destroy the careers of men like himself. Although I'm sure many of his fans will contest my conclusion, I here really doubt that something like pure skepticism was ever Hitchens' chief motivation or inspiration. Yet, aesthetically speaking, one never got the impression that Hitchens was ideologically vacuous. Quite the contrary, there always seemed to be something profound lurking in his words, something deep that Christopher Hitchens was hinting at, but never really deigned to talk about specifically. In some sense, Christopher Hitchens was not unlike the filmmaker J.J. Abrams, with the idea that a film, or in Hitchens' case a career speaking about politics, could be driven by a mystery box, an unresolved MacGuffin upon which an audience could project their own interests and desires. In typical form, a mystery box is simply a placeholder designed to keep the plot moving. It doesn't actually have anything in it. It doesn't need to have anything in it. But what if, in the case of Christopher Hitchens, the mystery box wasn't empty? What if Christopher Hitchens actually did believe in something, just not something he wanted to admit publicly? What if this idea was the same idea that motivated all new atheism, a mystery belief that could explain all of our anomalies? And perhaps this mystery idea is not too dissimilar to Hitchens' original ideological starting point, the utopian revolutionary worldview of Trotskyite Marxism. Here, I think, we have finally arrived at some vague notion at what might actually motivate new atheism behind the scenes, the ideological bank robbery that makes sense of all of the red-headed leaks of new atheism. But if we want to be specific, what exactly is this motivating concept? What exactly is this mystery idea? Well, it has many names, and not one that's agreed on. But for our purposes today, I will call this motivating concept human ontological and moral innocence, or, for brevity, by its easy-to-remember acronym, HOMI. In essence, human ontological and moral innocence, or HOMI, is simply the idea that humans, when stripped of influence from institutions, regulations, laws, and moral codes, tend by their nature towards rational thought, calm discourse, and moral action in a way that will, if left unabated, produce order, liberty, prosperity, and perhaps even equality. Another way of putting it might be to say that HOMI is equivalent to a naive political optimism about human nature and the human race. HOMI preaches that for humans to succeed, for humans to thrive, All that is really needed is to escape oppression. All that is needed is to be left alone to their own devices and their own desires. Now, understandably, people like this idea of homie. They like it a lot. They like it so much that they keep on finding new reasons to believe it and work it into their worldviews. And each time they try it, they give it a new name. And on its surface, it looks nice. Leaving aside more ancient forms of political optimism, we can see homie expressed in intellectual forms for at least 200 years now. And these forms are popular, especially among young people. You can see it in Rousseau's famous aphorism about men being born free, in Marx's fancy that absent capitalism, the state might wither away towards utopian communism. You can even hear it in the lyrics of popular songs, like John Lennon's Imagine. And even from my reactionary vantage point, even from my nature as a pessimist, I can sympathize. Homie is certainly a nice thought. Well, at least it's a comforting thought. But what's wrong with it? Well, that's easy. Homie is totally, undeniably, and demonstrably false. Humans do not work like this. Systems and ideas based on the principle of homie never work and never have worked in all human history. The ideas that use homie break down and fall apart quickly. Any political theory carrying homie as a tenet will misevaluate human nature and social organization and set itself up for failure. In short, homie, however seductive, is the mismeasure of mankind, and when this mismeasure reigns in power, human suffering inevitably follows. To be good, to live good lives, to reach what is sublime and transcendent in life, humans need guidance and structure. Behind the fixtures of our moral systems, our laws, and our customs, does not exist some primordial goodness waiting to be unlocked, but rather a portal to humanity's ruination and suicide. Man is better served by order than chaos, by ideology and discipline rather than its absence. Order is the goal of most human endeavors and the motivations of all human wisdom. However, it does not arise without effort. By contrast, chaos is the natural state of humanity and also its most feared and persistent foe. Humans, who have first-hand knowledge of chaos, real chaos, will do anything to avoid it. This, of course, isn't to say that law and order cannot become perverted and diseased. This is, in fact, a common human problem. But we find, even in a very diseased state of government, people will prefer corrupt and stifling order to the abyss of the unknown. How bad must a tyrant be in order to be worse than facing chaos and anarchy? Bad. Very bad. Almost inhumanly bad. So bad, in fact, that it's difficult to remember any tyrant who hasn't been able to partially justify his own rule as an alternative to anarchy and disorder. Indeed, many, if not most, tyrants and corrupt leaders have rested rods of iron on the proposition that tyranny is preferable to chaos. Nevertheless, it does not make the proposition any less true, and as a wise man once said, truth does make the best propaganda. But in our own, ever-enlightened modern age, have we forgotten this ancient wisdom about the falsehood of human ontological and moral innocence? That's actually a stupid question. Of course we've forgotten it. How else can you explain anything in our world? No one shouts all cops are bastards, or abolish the police, who has ever known a city without order. No crowd thoughtlessly tears down the statue of an explorer who has ever long thought about what it must be like to venture into the truly unknown. No one pulls down mores and regulations thinking he's going to find utopia, without thinking that goodness and rationality are inherent to human nature itself. Perhaps our folly wasn't always this stark, but the assumptions of homie have been creeping into the margins of our conversations about politics for quite some time now. It was subtle at first. You could see it in literature and not know how seriously to take it. Did people really mean what they were saying? Were even the older authors like Marx or Rousseau serious about their pronouncements? Many fans and experts of these thinkers asserted, and still assert, that these writers' utopian allusions were simply metaphorical and made to illustrate a point. Not being a scholar, I defer to their judgment. Experience, however, has taught me that in present day, the concept of human ontological and moral innocence is alive in a very, very non-metaphorical way. Someone at some point bought into homie. But how is this done when the principle itself is so obviously false? Well, this probably begins with the fact that homie is seductive. With homie, politics is easy. It's just a matter of getting rid of the bad people and making sure that the good people, most everyone, gets to do what they want to do without interference. It also doesn't hurt that this breakdown of complicated political issues is exactly the preferred way that young adults want to deal with their social surroundings. It turns out that there actually aren't any difficult political questions, just an eternal fight between the good people and the bad people, an eternal revolution against the man, so to speak. Classically, without homie, thinking and doing politics immediately becomes difficult. Even the most basic and simple political questions or ruminations come down to very difficult questions about what the good life is, or what moral action and human thriving ultimately entail. However, this is the only honest way to approach politics. It's daunting. The greatest minds of both the ancient and modern worlds have struggled with these basic questions, and these questions are impossible to avoid. Addressing politics in this way requires study and humility, and worst of all, deference to the past, all things that modern people are not particularly fond of. In short, homie is popular because it is seductive, and it's seductive because it's easy. And if the history of humanity, or the pornography industry, has taught us anything, it's that there are never any shortage of men to sell seductive lies, nor any shortage of men who are ready to believe them. The realm of human political ideology is no different, and throughout the generations there were always ideological hustlers who tried to sell their own ideas, laced with that sweet addictive syrup of human ontological and moral innocence. Usually this came in the form of some new utopianism designed to solve not only the problems of modernity, but in fact of all human history, to solve politics and end human suffering once and for all. However, reality is reality, and ideas don't become true because they are popular. After time elapsed, the game of these utopia pushers did become harder, following on the continuous failure of its proxies to deliver the goods. At the end of the 20th century, it seemed that most people were hip to the game. We weren't in the market for buying any new ideologies. We weren't in the market for any new isms, especially isms that seemed to have a utopian flavor to them. As the final generations of the 20th century, we millennials or Generation Xers didn't even like ideas or worldviews or labels. There was certainly no way anyone was going to sell us on ideology. But what about an anti-ideology? Sure, you're too cool to subscribe to any ism, but what about an anti-ism? After all, didn't you know atheism is just a lack of belief? At this point, some in the audience can likely see where this is going, and I can already hear the heckles rising on the other side of the screen. Atheism is simply rejection. It has nothing to do with progressive pieties, utopian visions, and seductive falsehoods about how humans operate. How can you claim that this pure form of skepticism and the application of materialist, evidence-driven examination is just a front for credulity to the most disproven human social idea in history? This is the objection I expect, especially from the liberal atheists, especially from the moderate atheists, the cool intellectuals, and the former followers of Christopher Hitchens. Yes, I do assert that atheism, as we know today, primarily the new atheism as it has been called, exists as a front for utopian credulity, exists as a front for homie. There is simply no other way to make sense of the facts otherwise. So perhaps we can try on this explanation and see if it fits. Returning to the original mystery of new atheism, how does our problem fare when we model new atheism as simply a cover for a naive, fallacious, but nonetheless eminently attractive and comforting idea? Why are modern atheists outspoken about their non-belief as non-belief, in direct contrast to their 19th and 18th century counterparts? Why did the new atheist movement get so quickly absorbed in progressive madness? Why were atheists so ecstatic about the possibility of non-belief? And why are they so unconcerned about not developing a positive vision for the world? Behind every mysterious question, the possibility that new atheism is simply a cover for the idea of human ontological and moral innocence answers each one. People were excited about new atheism because it gave them a new story through which they could believe that behind it all, behind all the layers of institutional morality, human beings had some solution to the manifest problems of modernity, one that was basic, one that was primitive, and one that did not involve any additional work. By presenting an ideological scapegoat, New Atheism gave its adherents a new portal to believe in Homie again. Of course, once started, this process couldn't be arrested. It was obvious that upon removing religion, and seeing that it failed to deliver the promised utopia, the search for other problematic positive views would have to be taken up again. Following the deconstruction of religion would naturally require the deconstruction of whiteness, capitalism, gender, sex, morality, and the family. And so proceeded New Atheism's descent into intersectionality. Again, the shoe fits. We have explained the phenomenon with the least number of objects, and William of Ockham's shaving tool is thoroughly satisfied. However, I think we need to go one step further in our indictment. Is there a way to show methodologically how the trick is performed, beyond just providing a model that explains the facts? Is there a way to show why this somewhat innocent-looking non-belief in a deity so readily and so predictably stands in for a naive, destructive, and manifestly false model of humanity? I think there is. Indeed, atheism, as we know it in modernity, is more than just a metaphysical belief about the universe. Obviously, it doesn't logically need to be like this, but more than anything else, since the Enlightenment, atheism has been a stand-in for an epistemological approach of materialistic skepticism, e.g., the belief that we can critically reject all statements of fact before well-ordered physical observations and experiments in the real world can validate them. As mentioned previously, this was the core positive epistemological and methodological approach that attracted me to New Atheism to begin with, and it's not hard to see why. Methodological materialism and methodological skepticism are part and parcel with how we approach the natural world and natural sciences. Given the success of this approach in those fields, it's only natural to want to mimic these efforts in others. The problem with this? Besides begging the ultimate question of materialism being true or not, the problem is that it is impossible to apply this method realistically, while at the same time the assumption is fundamentally limiting to a broader epistemological engagement with human existence. As many have pointed out, conducting controlled experiments in human social affairs is almost impossible. This is paired with the explosive unpredictability of the real world in any non-lab setting. Under these circumstances, experimental materialism and skepticism are little more than cargo cult epistemologies that cannot be applied rightly outside of simple metaphor and analogy. Of course, I use the term cannot be applied loosely here, because people have, and still do, try to apply these methods to policy, with predictably dismal results. Any scientific standard of evidence will inevitably pose a one-sided way of rejecting propositions, leaving behind only what is taken in as some default assumption or null hypothesis. This essentially leaves only two options open to the general-purpose skeptic. The first approach, sometimes sloppily labeled as modernist, is to come up with some default set of minimalistic assumptions, stripped of all superfluous affectations of culture and tradition that might be easily and emotionally identified as biased. The second approach, sometimes sloppily labeled as postmodernist, is to place no limitations on the skepticism, and to proceed simply to deconstruct everything and anything one can possibly conceptualize. The difficulty with the first approach is that, as much as the new atheist luminaries and their modernist predecessors would want, it's hard to defend the notion that some implicit human cultural norm can or should survive our skepticism. And this makes sense. After all, the basis of Western, and indeed most Eastern, morality systems is and was religion. Destroy the ground, and the building doesn't get to stand elevated by abstract skyhooks. Most people, like Dawkins and Hitchens, obviously wanted to return to some classical norm of society and morality, with slight modifications in a progressive direction. However, this will ultimately not do. Once you start deconstructing things at the level of fundamental belief and value, it's almost impossible to stop. Friedrich Nietzsche and other atheists of the 19th century understood this. Their modern successors in the 21st century pretend as if they have forgotten. The chief difficulty is that between the two methods we discussed, there are really no tools that modern atheists, read skeptics, have of defending any prima facie moral or political proposition against a population's desire to abolish it. Inevitably, the same barbs and argumentative tricks brought against Christianity and Islam can be used against any political principle. Skepticism in the pure sense is indeed the universal solvent. Anything can be deconstructed. But what lies as an alternative? Really nothing. Is this a problem? Well, not if you believe in human ontological and moral innocence, it isn't. With Homie, this process of continuous deconstruction becomes just part of our glorious and eternal revolution to overturn all external forms of human order and to finally liberate the primal, innocent human experience. Without Homie, if you want to get rid of a principle, even a destructive principle, then the only responsible intellectual focus of a conversation should be concerned with how it is replaced. Will we replace it with a new truth? Perhaps even a noble lie? Nevertheless, something is needed. But if we accept this truth, does atheism qua atheism even make sense as a political movement? And so here we find not only a possible root explanation, but a link of causation between our two subjects, New Atheism and Homie. As I've said before, while causal, this connection isn't logically necessary, but I anticipate much difficulty for anyone who tries to break this link by some newfangled version of atheism or skepticism, attempt to break the chain of deconstruction, attempt to halt the path of removing features and regulations and notions from human culture somewhere before the process is arrested by pure human appetite, and you will be met by all the usual tricks of the new atheists and progressives. And one should be prepared for this. Get ready for baseless burden shifting away from an assumed skeptical, read deconstructionist, default. Get ready for myopic demands for academic source after academic source, demands for scientific evidence for metaphysical, normative, or logical claims. Expect argument by analogy and mockery, and of course, be prepared for the favorite line of attack by both Christopher Hitchens and his SJW successors, the assertion that any defense of an old belief is also the defense of past atrocities performed by people who once held that old belief. These quote-unquote debunking tactics are easy because anything can be debunked or deconstructed under pure skepticism. It really doesn't matter whether the proposal is Kant, Zen Buddhism, or Jungian philosophy. The debunking script has already been written, and there is no shortage of self-appointed skeptics to lay its logic out in a predictable pattern. Atheism as skepticism, atheism as materialist deconstruction, only has an end result that might be considered good if we expect something good at the bottom of man's soul. It is only worthwhile if we believe in human ontological and moral innocence. And if you are an atheist and still following me so far, I anticipate you'll probably be asking, so what? Where does this actually leave me? Supposing that atheism, or new atheism, is simply a front for a seductive but ultimately false, naive idea about humanity, what, as an atheist, am I really supposed to take from this? And I will admit up front, this certainly is not a reason to believe in God. It isn't even a reason to not participate in the atheist political community. However, this certainly is a reason to not participate in an atheist political community if you dislike the ends of deconstructionist progressivism, or if you have any doubts about the manifest era of utopian schemes based on Homie. There is only one direction that political atheism can drive, and that is the direction of deconstruction. So be sure that that's your destination before you get on the bus. In a way, what I'm proposing here is simply an act of clarification. I want to replace one ideological conversation with another, much clearer ideological conversation. replacing the supposed conflict of new atheism versus superstition with the more accurate conflict between deconstructionist progressivism and any opposing worldview. And I have to ask, is this not just a more honest description about the conflict that's really going on? No one is or was really arguing about the existence of God. We were arguing over the limitations of liberal progressive political projects to improve the condition of humanity. Perhaps with this clarification out of the way, we can actually begin to talk about what we really mean and want, and leave the dry metaphysics to Alvin Plantinga. In other words, without deception, one can better pick a side in the battle that actually matters. The Red-Headed League has been removed, and now we can see the caper being planned in plain sight. What remains for us now is to decide whether we want to dedicate our efforts for or against the bank robbery underway. If you count yourself among the collaborators, if you believe in Homie, you are fully committed to deconstruction, to building a society based on innocent human nature and innocent human desire. As such, you may directly reject God and have that actually mean something. In some sense, anyone fully dedicated to this utopian project will probably have to reject God, or at least God's constraint on human will at some point. Under deconstruction, all human institutions and norms not linked to desire will certainly fall, and God, or the Word of God, will certainly be among them, like it or not. However, alternatively, if you see yourself in opposition to the caper being planned, if you do not believe in Homie, if you understand the manifest danger of chaos, your path as an atheist is slightly more complicated. Of course, this alone is not a reason to believe in God. It is only a reason to regard the idea of God with some reverence. As a guardian of human norms, the forms of the ancestors cannot be so readily discarded. If you do not ultimately find your way into some formal sense of religion, then one must commit to being a genuine spiritual seeker, or, failing even that, a nihilistic guardian of the noble lie. This option is harder to be sure, but in my opinion, it stands closer to the truth. But here, I want to definitively advise against any halfway measures. Really, just don't try them. There's no point in playing the fool to what's actually going on. There is no point in seeing the crime being planned, all the while posing as a patsy with a wink and a nod. It may be an open question to whether crime ultimately pays, but being a useful idiot never does. It just makes both sides hate you more. The same can be said for being a fair-weather collaborator. Don't start digging the hole of deconstruction and debunking, thinking that it's going to stop someplace where you're comfortable. Once you have committed to locating a utopian vision of humanity by stripping layers of institutions away under the purview of removing oppressive societal fixtures, there's really no stopping. It's Homie or bust. You either dig your way into the bank vault of the New World Order, or failing that, straight down to the gates of hell. Those are the stakes. But before I conclude this video essay and leave you with the moral dilemma, I would like to issue one general PSA for those people who want to collaborate on the progressive atheist and deconstructionist route. In this video, I've more or less analogized this choice to being part of a giant caper, and in doing so, I've implicitly associated this concept of deconstructive progressivism with the emotions one usually has about capers or large criminal operations. They're nefarious, they're illicit, they're secretive, and they're exciting. And on these associations, I think I need a little bit more commentary. While the eternal revolution of progressive deconstruction might in some sense be seen as nefarious or illicit, there is one thing that it is ultimately not. It's not exciting. In fact, in the long term, it's kind of boring. Early on, certainly, this boring quality is hard to see. Riding the wave of progressive and naive beliefs about humanity might feel exhilarating on the ride up, but no one wants to be around when the bubble pops. And I don't think that this prospect is too far off in present year. However cool people look as revolutionaries when they're in their 20s, do you ever wonder why there are so few in their 50s that seem satisfied with the lives they have led? Leaving aside the possibility of actually achieving a utopia, there's nothing really interesting about an old revolutionary. Even the concept seems to horrify the younger people that are swept up into the movement itself. In our modern age, the problem of aging gracefully is quite persistent, but how much more vexing is it for individuals who have dedicated themselves to revolutionary movements all about deconstructing and removing the old ways? I remember once, when seeing a video of the two Hitchens brothers together, both Peter and Christopher, that Christopher, as stylish as he was, didn't really seem like a man who had a plan on how to be old. Unlike his brother Peter, Christopher had arrived in his middle age with a young man's philosophy and a young man's demeanor, casting about, as always, for new ideas. Perhaps this affectation was a carryover from his early days as a Trotskyist. Certainly, whatever external philosophy Christopher Hitchens embraced at the moment, he was ever a believer in the eternal revolution, both of fashion and politics. And to his credit, during his life, he was always able to stay one step ahead of it. Perhaps this fact makes Christopher Hitchens himself a bit of an anomaly, because, on a long enough time frame, on a great enough scale, no matter how cool or new we think we are, the eternal revolution comes for everyone. The problem with Hitchens, the problem with Trotskyites, the problem with eternal revolutionaries and the people who want to stay fashionable forever is that at some point you can't keep up. The revolution keeps turning, and at some point you fall down. There is always someone waiting in the wings with an ice pick. While it's obvious to me that Hitchens would have certainly despised the SJWs that emerged shortly after his own death, I wonder how Christopher himself could have denied that these SJWs were the proper successors of the revolution that he had started. Any revolution that goes on long enough will eventually cancel everyone, starting with the old. After all, we are in the process of digging. If we cannot find the human utopian vision at this level, maybe the next, or the next after that. At some level, we will hit rock bottom and find mankind's true chaotic nature. There's a long way to go, but the only direction is down. Ultimately, though, perhaps I'm being too hard on the Trotskyists. Men need their gods, and the eternal revolution will do as well as any. I suppose it does provide meaning, even if the revolution it provokes ultimately leaves you behind, even if you are the one being sacrificed on its ever-thirsting altar. This being said, I think whether you ultimately put your faith in human moral innocence or not, it's important to understand what we are doing, and how what we are doing now does not fundamentally differ from what humans have always done in the past. We need to be honest. Only honesty can avoid being boring. Only with honesty can we ever approach the really big questions in life. And hey, I'll admit it, I haven't really addressed any big questions in this essay. I haven't even ventured an opinion on the really big question. The question of whether ultimate spiritual truth is actually real. And I'll be honest, I don't know the answer. Maybe there is no spiritual truth. Maybe, as Nietzsche put it, God is dead. And maybe when we engage politically, we are only arguing over which noble lie will dominate. Still, while the non-existence of God might be true, while it might be the end of human civilization, and will certainly be the great tragedy of humanity, it will never, in itself, be interesting.